London in 1817 was a city that had survived its century and was not entirely sure what to do with itself now that the war was over. The men who had made fortunes in the chaos of the French campaigns were moving their money into respectable shapes: land, industry, the careful marriage of daughters to titles. The men who had lost fortunes in the same chaos were doing the same thing with considerably more desperation and considerably less material to work with. The drawing rooms of Mayfair operated as a kind of secondary government. Information moved through them faster than it moved through the newspapers, and with considerably more accuracy, because the newspapers required evidence and the drawing rooms required only confidence. Reputation in this world was not merely a social pleasure. It was infrastructure. It was the thing that kept credit flowing and invitations arriving and doors opening. Lose it, and the entire architecture of your life could come down inside a single season. Eleanor Ashford understood this better than almost anyone she knew. She had grown up in a family that sat at the respectable edge of good society, close enough to matter, not quite close enough to be untouchable. Her father, Sir Edmund Ashford, had been a man of genuine intelligence and genuine warmth and a very specific kind of blindness that afflicts people who trust easily, the kind of blindness that mistakes the performance of trustworthiness for the thing itself. He had invested in the wrong ventures. He had believed the wrong men. And when he died 2 years ago, quietly in the winter, after a brief illness that was in fact a long, slow surrender to a grief he never named, he left Eleanor a house, a title of courtesy she could not use, and debts that she had spent 14 months quietly, methodically, invisibly paying. Nobody knew. This was the point. Nobody in Eleanor's social world had any idea that the Ashford finances were in the state they were in, because Eleanor had decided, with the cold clarity of someone who has just understood that the alternative is catastrophe, that the information would stay inside this house. She had sold 2 things of value that her father had loved and that she therefore also loved. She had let go of 2 servants who had been with the family for years. With references she spent an afternoon writing, and a private guilt she still carried. She had taken in a boarder, a young woman from the country who needed a season in London, and whose family paid handsomely for the address and the social cover. And she had presented this arrangement to the world as a favour to an old acquaintance. She was observant, Eleanor Ashford. She had always been observant. But the years since her father's death had turned observation into something almost architectural. She could walk into any room in London, and within 20 minutes she could map it. Who held the real money, and who only held the appearance of it, who was desperate and pretending otherwise, where the alliances were and where they were fraying, which marriages were working and which were excavated, shells with beautiful facades. She read people the way other women read correspondence, quickly, thoroughly, and without sentiment. She had one close friend. Clara Voss was the wife of a prosperous merchant, a woman who moved between the merchant world and the gentry world with a ease that slightly unnerved people in both of them, because she belonged fully to neither and was therefore beholden to neither. Clara had quick eyes and a dry wit and the specific social superpower of being someone that very different kinds of people confided in, because she made every one of them feel that she was particularly and privately on their side. Eleanor had known her for 4 years. She trusted her, within the limits that Eleanor trusted anyone, which were limits she had set deliberately and reviewed regularly. And then there was Lord Julian Cavendish. She had not set out to have a careful, distant relationship with Julian Cavendish. It had simply become the shape of things between them, in the way that some relationships take a form before either party has decided on it. He was the most admired and least readable man in any room he entered. He was 33. He had inherited unexpectedly 3 years ago when his elder brother Richard died in what was called an accident, a fall from a horse on a clear autumn morning on familiar ground. Julian had been a second son all his life, which meant he had been educated for a profession, and was therefore better prepared for the actual mechanics of power than most men born to it. He had moved into his inheritance with a patient, methodical efficiency that made people slightly uncomfortable in a way they could not entirely articulate. Eleanor kept her distance from Julian Cavendish because she had decided, after observing him for approximately 6 months, that she could not read him. And things she could not read made her careful. What she had not fully accounted for, in those careful 2 years of distance, was that he might be reading her. It was at Lady Pembridge's salon, the weekly gathering functioned as the informal Parliament of Mayfair, that the first thread presented itself. Eleanor had been there on a Tuesday evening in late October, 3 weeks before the night of the letter, standing near the fireplace with a glass of negus she was not drinking, half listening to a conversation across the room between 2 men she barely knew. A barrister named Colworth and a man she could not place, grey-haired, heavy-set, with the permanent squint of someone who spent a great deal of time reading small print in poor light. She was not attending to them deliberately. She was thinking about something else entirely, the specific calculation of whether she could manage the coal bill before the end of the month without dipping into the reserve she had set aside for the spring rates, and then she heard it, not a sentence, not enough for a sentence, a fragment, her father's name and a year and the word decision, Sir Edmund Ashford. And then Colworth's companion lowered his voice and the fragment was gone. She did not move. She did not turn her head. She stood with her glass and her composed face, and she replayed what she had heard with the precision of someone transcribing dictation. She did not go to Clara. She did not ask anyone anything. She went home that night and she sat in the dark in the house on Welbeck Street. No candles, no fire, because both cost money. And she held the fragment up to the light of her own intelligence and turned it very slowly, examining every face. She told herself it was coincidence. People mentioned names in passing. 1814 was a year that had meant something in everyone's financial history because the war had ended and the economy had shuddered and readjusted in ways that affected nearly everyone she knew. There was nothing remarkable about her father's name appearing in a conversation about that year. She told herself this. She did not believe it, not entirely, and the part of her that did not believe it settled in at the back of her mind and waited there, very quietly, in the dark. She saw Julian Cavendish 3 days later at a dinner in a Mayfair house on Brook Street that she had almost declined because the coal bill was still outstanding and new gloves were a conversation she was having with herself repeatedly. She had gone because Clara had insisted, in the particular way Clara insisted on things, not with pressure, but with a quiet certainty that you would eventually arrive at her conclusion, and an implicit offer to speed the process by simply being right. They were seated beside each other. Not by accident, Eleanor would later reflect. Nothing about that evening, it turned out, had been by accident, but in the moment she noticed only that Julian Cavendish settled into the chair to her right with the specific economy of movement that distinguished him. He never did anything more than was necessary physically, which gave him an odd quality of stillness in rooms full of people performing animation. For the first part of the meal they exchanged the usual currency, the weather, the music at the Harrington concert, whether Lord So-and-so's speech in the Lords had been as tedious as advance reports suggested. Julian was good at this in the precise way that indicated he found it completely uninteresting. Eleanor was good at it in the precise way that indicated she was using it as cover for watching something else. And then he said, with the perfect conversational lightness of someone who has carefully designed a question to sound like small talk, "Your father served on the Select Committee for Trade Improvements, I believe, in 14. The year, the specific year, she did not miss a beat," she said pleasantly, that she believed he had sat on a number of committees over the years, and that she had never paid very close attention to the specifics, as committee work had always struck her as the kind of thing men found more interesting than women were expected to. She said this with a smile that was warm and perfectly accurate, the smile of a woman who is gracefully performing the limits of feminine interest, which was a very useful disguise for a woman who was in fact paying exquisitely close attention to everything. He accepted the deflection with a small smile of his own. He did not press. He turned to the other side and spoke to the woman to his left for the remainder of the first course, and Eleanor turned to the man on her right and spoke entirely normally for 4 minutes while a portion of her mind that had nothing to do with the conversation ran the exchange she had just had through every possible interpretation it could sustain. Was he testing her? Warning her? Simply curious, following some thread of his own that had nothing to do with her? Was the mention of 1814 connected to what she had overheard at the salon? Or was she building architecture from coincidence because her mind, always looking for pattern, had found one where none existed? On the carriage home she replayed the smile 3 times, the particular quality of it, the way it had appeared just after she deflected. Not disappointed, not suspicious, but something closer to interested, as though her deflection itself had been informative. She went home and she did not sleep for a long time. She began the following week to pull at the thread. She was methodical about it, because she was methodical about everything that mattered, and she was very clear with herself that she was not yet sure what she was looking for, only that she was looking. Clara was her first resource, not because she told Clara what she suspected, but because Clara's world overlapped with the merchant and financial houses in ways that Eleanor's did not, and Clara could ask questions in those places without raising the eyebrows that Eleanor would have raised. Eleanor said only that she was curious about the financial situation in 1814 as it related to a set of railway land investments, and that she was trying to understand something about her father's estate the solicitor had not been able to clarify. Clara listened. She said she would see what she could find. Her eyes, Eleanor noted, were very steady during this exchange. She filed this away. Her second resource was a man named Mr. Petch. He had been a senior clerk at the financial house that had managed her father's affairs for 15 years, and he had loved Sir Edmund with the specific loyalty of a man who has been genuinely treated well by someone who did not have to treat him well, and who intends to honour that decency long after the person who offered it is gone. He was retired now. He took his constitutionals on Tuesday mornings in Hyde Park, and it was there, on a cold grey Tuesday in November, that Eleanor walked beside him for 40 minutes and asked him, very carefully, what he remembered about the Ashford investments of 1814. What Mr. Petch remembered was this: there had been a consortium, a group of men, he did not know all their names, had never been told all their names, who had presented a set of railway land investments as opportunities of the first order, backed by documentation that was either impeccable or an impeccable forgery. Several families had invested. Several of them had lost everything. The official account was that the speculation had simply failed, that the railway routes had proven unviable, and the land had been repurchased at a fraction of the price by the original vendors. But Mr. Petch, who had spent 50 years reading financial documents, and who had a particular sensitivity to the point at which coincidence becomes pattern, had always believed the failure had been arranged. He had believed it and had said nothing, because he was a clerk, and the men involved were not clerks, and there are things that a man in his position understands he is not able to say without consequences that will follow him to his grave. He said this to Eleanor on a cold Tuesday morning in Hyde Park, looking straight ahead, his voice very quiet, and she walked beside him and listened and kept her face entirely free of the thing happening behind it. There was a name she did not yet have, the man at the centre of it. Petch had a shape for him, someone with social position, someone with access to both financial circles and political ones, someone whose involvement could be coordinated without being visible. But not a name, not yet. She went home and she wrote down everything she had, not in a diary or any document that could be found, but in a private notation she kept in her own shorthand inside a household accounts book where it would be entirely invisible to anyone who picked it up. She wrote down 1814, the consortium, the families, her father's name, Julian Cavendish's question, the specific quality of his smile. She did not yet know what she was holding, but she knew she was holding something. Julian continued appearing. This was the other thing happening during these weeks, running parallel to her investigation like a second current under the surface of a river. He came to a musicale at the Voss house that, to Eleanor's certain knowledge, he had declined the previous 2 years. He was there at the Harrington Gallery opening, standing 4 feet from her for nearly an hour, which was close enough for conversation but which he did not force. He engineered one private exchange at Lady Welbourne's card evening, and he spent it talking about something entirely unrelated to anything, and watching her in a way that she found increasingly difficult to categorize. It was not the way men looked at women they wished to pursue. She knew that look and had learned to manage it efficiently. It was something different, closer, she thought, to the way she had learned to look at rooms, scanning for information, reading what was present and what was absent. He was watching her the way she watched other people, and the recognition of this unsettled her in a way she could not entirely suppress. She held 2 fears simultaneously, and she was honest enough with herself to name both of them. The first, that Julian Cavendish was involved in what happened to her father, and that his sudden interest in her was because she had begun to investigate, and that she had been less careful than she thought. The second, that Julian Cavendish was not involved, and that she was allowing her suspicion of him to prevent her from accessing information he might have that could help her. Both fears were equally actionable. Both pulled in opposite directions, and Eleanor was very tired of not knowing which direction to pull. She was in this state, careful, watchful, suspended between 2 opposing possibilities. On the night of the Pembridge winter ball, when Clara materialized beside her in the doorway of the main corridor and tilted her head, very slightly, toward a passage to the left and said, "There is a library down that hall. I left something there, on the reading table, that I thought you might want to look at while you have a moment." And then she was gone, absorbed back into the ballroom, before Eleanor could ask a single question. The letter was on the reading table, exactly where Clara had said it would be. It was folded inside a larger document, some sort of estate paper, and Eleanor almost missed it. Almost. She read it twice in the dark. She folded it and pressed it against her wrist, and then she opened the library door and walked back into the light. "Here is where I want you to stay close, because this is the part that matters most, and it requires your attention. The next hour of Eleanor Ashford's life is the hour that everything before it was building toward, and I am not going to rush it." She came back into the ballroom, and she was, to every eye in it, exactly what she had always been: composed, intelligent, pleasantly present. She accepted a glass of champagne from a footman and did not drink it. She spoke briefly to 2 women she knew. She scanned the room with the specific patience of someone who is looking for one person and is managing the time until she finds him. Julian was standing near the far window with 2 men she recognized from Parliament. He was listening to one of them with the polite attention he gave to things that did not particularly interest him. His posture was very still. When Eleanor moved across the room, he saw her before she reached him. She was certain of this, because something in his stillness shifted, fractionally, in the way that a room shifts when a door opened somewhere in the house, even if you cannot see the door. She stopped beside him. She said pleasantly that she was in need of some air, and that she had heard the garden was arranged beautifully this season, even in the winter, and she wondered if he might be willing to show her, as she did not want to wander out alone. The 2 parliamentary men registered this exchange with the particular attention men give to something that looks like a romantic overture, and Julian said, "Of course," and offered his arm, and they walked out together into the cold. The garden was not beautifully arranged. It was November, and the flower beds were bare, and the gravel path was faintly damp, and the only light came from the windows above them, where the ball continued without them. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. Eleanor removed his arm from hers and turned to face him, and she said, "I want to ask you about 1814. He was very still. She watched his face the way she had been rehearsing watching it, looking for the specific thing she was afraid to find there. What she had prepared herself for was some version of wariness, controlled alarm, the particular shift in a person's expression when they discover that someone knows more than expected. What she saw instead was something she had not prepared for, a kind of recognition, not the recognition of being caught, something older than that, something closer to relief. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Above them, the music continued. Someone laughed the same bright high laugh from earlier in the evening. The cold settled around them like a third presence. "What do you know?" he said. She had decided, in the 40 seconds it had taken to walk from the window to the garden, how much to give him. Not everything. She was not reckless. She told him about Petch, and about the shape of the consortium, and about what her father had lost. She told him about the railway speculation that was not what it had been presented as. She did not mention the letter against her wrist. She watched his face as she spoke. He did not defend himself. He did not deflect. He stood in the cold garden and he listened to her with the complete and particular attention of someone for whom every word she is saying carries enormous weight, and when she finished he was quiet, for a moment that lasted just long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. Then he said, "My brother wrote to me from this house in October of 1814. He had found something, he said, something that he needed time to document before he could act on it. He asked me to wait. He was dead 3 weeks later." She did not speak. She waited. "I have spent 18 months, he said, building what Richard could not finish, carefully, quietly, because the man at the center of it is powerful enough to destroy the case and everyone connected to it if he learns of it before I am ready." He looked at her steadily. "And he is in that ballroom." Eleanor stood in the cold November garden and did not move for a moment that she would later be unable to measure. Something in her chest that had been held in a particular tight configuration for 2 years was doing something she could not quite name, not releasing exactly, more like recognizing. She said, "The letter." Something moved across his face. "What letter?" She reached into her glove. She held it out. He took it, and she watched him read it by the light coming from the windows above, and she watched the exact quality of the stillness that came over him as he did. He had not known about this letter. She was absolutely certain of it. Whatever she had feared she might find in his face, this was not it. This was a man reading his dead brother's words for the first time, in the cold, with controlled and terrible care, and she looked, a way to give him something approaching privacy for it. When he handed it back, she said, "Who is it?" He told her. "Lord Pembridge. Charles Pembridge, husband to the social sovereign of their world, master of this house, smiling host of the party playing out above their heads. Charles Pembridge, who had managed for 3 years to stand in the centre of the thing he had engineered, and be entirely invisible, because everyone was looking at his wife. Eleanor thought of every salon she had attended in this house, every cup of tea accepted, every evening of music, every polite exchange in that drawing-room above her head. She thought of Lady Pembridge, who had been kind to her in the specific way that women of unassailable position can afford to be kind to women who are not. And she thought of what it would cost, that woman, when the truth came out, and she filed this away to feel properly later, because right now she needed to think. She said, Clara knew. It was not a question. Julian looked at her, and what she read in his face was the answer, before he gave it. Clara had known for months. Clara had been, quietly and with no announcement, working alongside Julian, providing social access, gathering information in the spaces she moved through that Julian could not reach, moving pieces into position, the library, the letter, the careful placement of Eleanor herself. In the right moment, with the right information, none of it accident. All of it trust, expressed in the form of careful action rather than declaration. Eleanor absorbed this. She held it up and examined it, the way she examined everything, looking for what it meant. Clara had not told her. She had not asked. She had instead placed Eleanor in a position to discover the truth herself, to arrive at her own conclusions, to choose her own next action. She had been trusted, not managed. This was the difference, Eleanor understood, between what Pembridge had done to her father and what the people she actually loved had done to her. Her father had been managed, given a shape of information designed to produce a particular action. She had been given the truth and left to arrive at it at her own pace, in her own way, and trusted to know what to do with it when she got there. She looked at Julian Cavendish in the cold November garden. She said, "What do you need?" he told her. And she listened with complete attention, because it was her turn now, and she intended to do it properly. What she felt, standing there, she did not name it. She kept it in the place where she kept things that were too large to address immediately. But her hands, which had been still since the library, were still for a different reason now. Not because she was suppressing what she felt, because the thing she felt did not require suppression. It had somewhere to go. They stayed in the garden for perhaps 20 more minutes. When they went back inside, Eleanor walked back into Lady Pembridge's ballroom and smiled at Lady Pembridge, who smiled back, and the two women exchanged a few pleasant sentences about the music, and Eleanor did not allow any of what she knew to alter the warmth of her expression by a single degree. She was very good at this. She had spent years becoming very good at this. She had not understood, until tonight, that it could be useful for something that mattered. What happened next took a fortnight. Julian had the documentation, Richard's original findings, 18 months of his own careful additions. The paper trail that Pembridge had been so certain was buried deep enough that no one would ever dig to it. What they needed was distribution. Delivery to enough men of standing simultaneously that no single conversation could suppress it. No single threatened friendship could close the door before the others opened. Eleanor knew exactly which 3 men to approach. She had spent 2 years mapping this world. She knew where the fault lines ran. She went to them separately, quietly, over the course of 4 days, and she was very precise about what she said and how she said it. And by the time anyone might have thought to warn Pembridge, documented evidence was in the hands of 3 men who could not afford to ignore it, and who had, each of them, their own private reason to wish Pembridge diminished. It was not a trial. In this world, the most complete destruction was never a trial. A trial required publicity. Publicity required implicating others. And implicating others meant the kind of collateral damage that the men receiving the documents had their own reasons to avoid. What happened to Charles Pembridge was quieter than a trial, and is its way more complete. His credit vanished. His political position was politely but permanently withdrawn. The invitations stopped arriving. Lady Pembridge left London for the country house in Wiltshire, and the weekly salons that had been the centre of Mayfair society simply ceased, and after a while people found other centres. The families that had been ruined in 1814 could not be fully restored. Eleanor understood this. The money was gone, absorbed into the mechanisms of the conspiracy long ago. But the record, the official, documented record of what had happened and why, was corrected. Her father's name was cleared. The failure that had followed him into his grave and that had settled on his daughter's shoulders, as a weight she had carried for 2 years, was publicly and formally attributed to its actual cause. She stood in the drawing-room on Welbeck Street the morning after the 3rd man confirmed his receipt of the documents. The room had been cold since October, because coal was something she rationed with great precision. But she had lit a fire today, because she had decided that today she was allowed a fire. The light moved over the furniture that had been her father's, over the portrait above the mantel of the man himself. Painted when Eleanor was 12, when he was still fully himself, before the slow, Accumulation of wrong decisions and trusted betrayals had quietly hollowed him out. She looked at the portrait for a long time. She had not allowed herself to do that in 2 years, to look at it and feel what it contained. She had walked past it every day with her eyes somewhere else, because feeling it would not help, and she could not afford anything that did not help. Now she stood in front of the fire and she let it come. The grief that had been waiting, patient and large, for its moment, the anger underneath the grief, and underneath the anger, something that was not quite joy but was in the neighborhood of it. The specific feeling of having done the thing you were the only one positioned to do, and having done it properly. She stood there for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the street outside a cart horse went by, and now we come to what remains. There is something between Eleanor Ashford and Julian Cavendish that has no polite name yet, and I think they are both content, for the moment, to let it remain nameless. They have not declared anything. They have not needed to. Some things are established not by announcement, but by a shared understanding that the work is not finished, and you intend to keep doing it together, and that is enough for now, and perhaps it is more than enough. Clara, when Eleanor found her the day after the garden, said nothing in her own defence, because she had not done anything that required defence. She had simply moved the pieces to where they needed to be, and trusted Eleanor to know what to do next. Eleanor had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, "Next time, tell me sooner." And Clara had smiled in the particular way she smiled at things she found satisfying. What I want to leave you with is not a conclusion exactly. Eleanor Ashford's life did not conclude. It continued, as lives do, into something she was only beginning to be able to imagine. But I want you to see her as I see her. She is standing at a window in the early morning. The first light is grey and thin, and London is not yet properly awake. The carts are moving, but the voices have not started yet. She has a cup of tea that has gone slightly cold while she was thinking, and she is thinking about what her father did not know and could not have known, and what she herself knows now, which is simply this: that silence is never neutral, that every secret has a weight, and the weight is never distributed evenly. It falls on the people who were not there to help choose it, that the women who survive in this world, and more than survive in it, are not the ones who look away from what is in front of them. They are the ones who look steadily and act on what they see. She holds her cold cup of tea. The light grows in the window, and for the first time in a very long time, her hands are still, not because she is carrying something too large to respond to, but because she has nothing left to hold back. The letter is ashes. She burned it the night after the garden. She had memorized it, as she memorized everything that mattered, and the paper itself was no longer necessary. She did not need a dead man's warning any more. She knew what she knew, and she knew what to do with it.